Welcome in to the Rock Talk Studio, the podcast where we dissect, analyze, and discuss the world of rock and roll books, documentaries, and movies. Today we're going to take a look at the Cheap Trick book entitled This Band Has No Past. Is this book worth your time and money? Well, the next 15 minutes of this rock and roll conversation will definitely point you in the right direction. And I promise to deliver to you with all the passion of a Bob Dylan protest song. I'm your host, Big Rick. Let's plug in. So let me break down how the show is set up. It's got three main sets. In the first set, I review the book, and then I give the book the official Rock Talk Studio rating. Second set, I take a look at what a true fan is going to get out of this book. If you're a Cheap Trick fan, is there anything in here that you haven't heard before, or is this really worth your time? I'll let you know. And what about a casual fan? I'll also take a look at a casual fan. I want to make sure that, if you've got some thoughts or questions about Cheap Trick, I answer those and tell you if this book is worth your time. The third set, I do my best to answer an impossible to answer rock and roll question. And then like every good rock and roll show that has an encore, we've got an encore here too. The encore is where I've dug around and found just another gem, something that you've got to check out. The next part of the conversation here for Cheap Trick, something you need to read, see, or hear about the band. All right, let's get going. Let's get into the review of the Cheap Trick book, This Band Has No Past. This book was really frustrating, and I'm going to get this out right in the beginning. It's just too much, and it's too bad because credit where credit is due. The writer of the book, Brian Cramp, went above and beyond, man. I will give him that, definitely, and I really admire the devotion. I can't even imagine the ton of work that he must have put into this obvious passion project about this great enduring power pop four-piece band from Illinois, Cheap Trick. To me, the Cheap Trick story needs to be documented and told, and Cramp mined the Cheap Trick universe for what seemed like every little mention of the band ever written, recorded, or even whispered about from anyone who even remotely came across their path or had an opinion about them. I mean, this book is 524 pages long, and I can't help wondering, how long it must have took to put this together. He really, really spent a lot of time and energy on this, so it's hard to say negative things about it, but I got to be truthful about this book. I mean, the concept is really cool. I really like that. It's interesting. The book only tells a story up until the huge hit of Live Budokan record. So it's a true coming up thing that really gives you a step-by-step of the buildup of how their mainstream until their mainstream breakthrough. And that is what plays villain to this book. It was the overload and depth for a story that only tells probably a little over a quarter of their career. I mean, does the reader really need to know what band Cheap Trick saw when they traveled to LA in the 80s? I'm sure, okay, why not if it was a cool story, but do we need a reprint of the review of the Alex Harvey Band, the band they saw? Total overshare. And there's also a lot of what was happening in society. He wrote about what was going on during the times, but do we need to know the cultural ramifications of the movie Jaws? If it made a huge difference on the band, sure, but I just don't see where it did. And do I really need to know where the band played on November 10th in 1975? They played Madison, Wisconsin. Okay. And then on the 12th, they were in Fontana. The 13th, they were in Appleton. I get it. That's pretty cool at first to lay out what their schedule looked like. And it really does display the depths of their grind. And that was one of the impressive things about this band, their true love of playing live. And they would play anywhere at any time. But when it's done over and over and documenting years of playing clubs, it just became white noise. I tried hard not to skip ahead with this book. And to me, that's oh man, I hate that. I hate skipping ahead or trying not to skip ahead, especially and this was a clincher for me. He did two and a half full pages of just adjectives the press used to describe Cheap Trick. I mean, that's all it was just adjectives for 2.5 pages. And then he did it again, another 2.5 pages of adjectives he used to describe Rick Nielsen. It was a slog at times, and it was just too bad, especially because this is a unique band who carved out a really nice little spot in rock and roll history, and the story really does lay out their love of playing out. And they became this must-see band in the Midwest for years. I mean, it's a talented band with a very different type of guitar player and one of rock's standout personalities in Rick Nielsen, and what I feel is a very, very underrated lead singer. I mean, Robin Zander can sing the shit out of anything. In the book, there's another great Who Opened for Who story. Tom Petty opened for them on their last show before they were signed, and Petty claimed that Robin Zander was one of the most powerful lead singers he's ever seen and that the band was going to be huge. I also want to mention that the only member in Cheap Trick, only original member, was Bunny Carlos, who contributed to the book. So only Bunny's in the book. So it's definitely missing the scope of what the other members went through, especially the outspoken Nielsen, who I'm sure would have had a lot to offer and would have spiced up the book with his oddball, though very smart in regards to the technical side of music personality. And in case you think I'm exaggerating about the pylon of documented moments of Cheap Trick's career, there is a 211-page bibliography at the end of the book. 211 pages. I have never, ever seen anything like that before. Though I got to give him this. There is a cool introduction from Jeff Emmett of Pearl Jam. I'll give him that. Coming up next, we stamp the official Rock Talk Studio rating on the book, and this one, I have to admit, it took a while to come to terms with. Question, a different opinion? Hey, who doesn't? We're talking rock and roll here. Shout out to me, rocktalkstudio@gmail.com. Let me know what you think, especially if you're a Cheap Trick fan. I would love to know what a Cheap Trick fan thinks about this book. If you've read the book, am I right? Am I wrong? Am I way off base? Let me know. rocktalkstudio@gmail.com. Okay, now it's time to put our official Rock Talk Studio rating on this book. The rating system is 1, you're in the front row. Doesn't get any better. Highly recommended. 2, you're in the loge seats. Not a bad view. Still recommended. And 3, you're in the nosebleeds, baby. And Cheap Tricks, this band has no past. I'm not going to throw this thing into the nosebleeds. I mean, this band has no history is a 2. You're in the loge, but you're in the way back. It's not horrible. There's just too much archival info, and I respect the work that was done to put this story together. So I'm not going to say it's a nosebleeder. Would I recommend? Well, I think the next set, let's use that as determining if it's recommended or not. So I'm going to break it down from a fan's point of view, if you're a Cheap Trick fan, and then I'm going to break it down, let's say you're just a casual fan, what you're going to think about it then. Here's the part of the show where we break it down and recommend it for a fan of Cheap Trick, or if you're just a casual fan. If you're just a casual fan, is it worth your time? Is it worth your energy, worth your money to invest in this book? So let's start with fan. And I think you really have to be almost a super fan to get through this book. It's that full of info. And then I was thinking about okay, I would say I'm a super fan of Dylan. Now, if this was a Dylan book, would this been too much for me to read? Would I still have enjoyed it? It would have been a lot. I got to be honest. So I would love to hear from any super fan or fan of Cheap Trick. What did you think of this book? rocktalkstudio@gmail.com. Hit me up. Let me know what you thought. I'm dying to hear a super fan's opinion. So let's flip it over and take a look at a casual fan. I think a casual fan is going to have a hard time with this one. If a super fan is going to have a hard time, I think a casual fan is going to have a real hard time. I really wanted to learn more about this band, and I really like the band. But this huge presentation and that it was over 500 pages to tell a quarter of the story made it tough. All right, let's move on to our third and final set. In the third and final set, I'm going to answer an impossible to answer rock and roll question about Cheap Trick. What happens when you follow or subscribe to the Rock Talk Studio or leave me a 5-star review? Well, first of all, I'm really, really appreciative of that, because the reason why I do this is because I love rock and roll. I love talking about rock and roll, and I want the art form, the conversation about it, and the music to live on. And, as the makers of the music, they, are starting to head into the final chapters of their lives, I think it's important to honor them and keep celebrating the music that was made during those classic rock and roll years. So hit that subscribe button, join this community, and know that any support is really, really appreciated. Now it's time for the impossible question. First of all, no, the impossible question has no definitive answer. It's impossible to answer. The reason why I come up with it is it's just a different way to look at an artist, a different scenario, and you get to throw around a kind of a weird rock and roll possibility. Today's question is, what happens if Cheap Trick never released Live at Budokan? I mean, what would have happened if that album didn't come out? Because it's really interesting. They didn't want it to come out. They were in the midst of a new record, and they were totally against it. They didn't like the cover. They didn't like the sound. They didn't like really anything about it at first, and the record label pushed them to put the record out. And man, this thing became an iconic live record. I mean, one of Rolling Stone's top 500. It sold 3-4 million copies. It's in the National Recording Registry in the Library of Congress. I mean, that's some pretty high honors for just a live throwaway album at first. And this album just took them over the top, gave them that really big mainstream stamp. But what would have happened to the band? And I'm thinking about who they are at their core, and they kind of remind me of the Jay Giles Band. They're this super huge live band following. I mean, Giles had their hit later in their career, but this one came, right at less than half of their career. I think they would have continued on, and I think they still would have been an iconic band because of their commitment to the road, because of their love of the road, and they still wrote some great songs after Budokan. Budokan was just kind of a fluke. I'm glad it happened for them. It pushed them out there. But I think this band could have still had a huge legacy, even though that live record never came out. What do you think? Could have Cheap Trick survived and went on after the live Budokan record? That's the impossible question. There's no definitive answer, but it is kind of fun to kick it around. When we come back, we're going to give you the encore to the show. The encore is something I dug up on Cheap Trick. Something you got to see, hear, or read about this band. Before we jump in the final set, the encore, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I've been reading, what I've been watching, and what's coming up next on the podcast. The next show will be about Creedence. There's a documentary out live at Royal Albert Hall. I just finished watching that and writing up the show. So that next show is the Creedence documentary. And followed by that, I just finished up reading The Debauchery. That is the new Matt Sorum book. Matt Sorum, the drummer for The Cult, Guns N' Roses, Stone Temple Pilots, Billy Gibbons, to name a few. So that's coming up after that. Perfect segue for that podcast is the documentary Let There Be Drums. So that will be the next 3 shows. All right. Let's get into our encore. Hey, what's a rock and roll show without an encore? We got to have an encore. This show definitely has an encore. And what the encore is, this is where I kind of mine around and dig around and try to find something else about Cheap Trick that's really cool that I would suggest that if you're really into the band or really like this book, you'd want to check this out too. And what I came up with was the Cheap Trick performance at Daryl's house. The show Daryl's House with Daryl Hall. Cheap Trick is on there and they rip through a bunch of tunes, really, really great renditions of a couple of songs, and they pull off a kick-ass version of the Hall & Oates song Family Man. You got to check it out. It's really good. That's the encore for today's show, Cheap Trick at Daryl's house. Thanks for tuning in. Love talking rock and roll and appreciate anyone who takes a few minutes out of their day to enjoy the ride with me. Remember, you can find other and future episodes at rocktalkstudio.buzzsprout.com. All right, tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road. We'll see you next time in the Rock Talk Studio.